I wonder if you dare, you could spare us a thought for the level of confidence around the Israeli government at the moment at achieving a ceasefire deal with Hamas. Is it very 50-50? Or is there a silent, expectant hope that Hamas will do what they need to do, sign on the line, and you can get this thing done?
There is a cautious optimism in Israel that the nightmare that Hamas started exactly 2 years ago by launching this war with the October 7th massacre could be on its way to ending. I would have been skeptical about Hamas's answer and dismissed it as a trick, but the Prime Minister was sounding very bullish in an address to the nation the other night, saying anyone who thinks it's too good to be true, it's true, this is happening, saying he hopes to be announcing good news as early as this week. And after 2 years of war, that combination of military pressure and diplomatic pressure that has left Hamas isolated with even its state sponsors telling it game's up, have brought us to a position where Hamas may be willing to release those hostages it has been torturing in dungeons under Gaza and agree to a plan to dismantle itself.
OK, look, there are negotiations going on. That indicates it is, far from a done deal. What are the key sticking points here? We know that this is a US-brokered ceasefire plan. We know that the Israeli Prime Minister has signed off on this version of the plan. But there may be a conditional acceptance by Hamas, or that all points may not be necessarily sign-offable by them. What are the sticking points as you understand them?
I think what the United States has been able to do with this plan has been to separate the hostage ransom negotiations from the negotiations to end the war. First of all, it's saying all the hostages have to come back immediately in exchange for a ransom. Israel is negotiating with terrorists. It will release convicted terrorists, including terrorist masterminds with a great deal of blood on their hands, and there may be some haggling over that ransom and which masterminds may or may not be released. But the hostages get out first. Once that is over, the question is the plan to end the war, because the deal essentially says Hamas must dismantle itself, or else Israel will have the United States full backing to finish the job, which nobody wants to do. We've had more than enough of this war. But essentially it comes down to whether Hamas is feeling enough pressure from its state sponsors, from Qatar and Turkey specifically, to really relinquish power in Gaza and to agree to a plan to give up its weapons. We saw just this week Israel found 2 tunnels located underneath hospitals in Gaza. They found weapons in kindergartens, long-range rockets ready for fire. Hamas's terrorist army is very much still alive. But it does come down to that question. Is Hamas really willing to dismantle itself? And can that timetable for Israel's withdrawal to the Gaza Strip be linked to the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip and the disarmament of Hamas? Of course, if that doesn't happen, we know that the next war would only be a matter of time.
OK, look, the Times has seen a contingency plan drawn up by the Israeli military if Hamas rejects this ceasefire, and it includes putting civilians in Gaza into 5 controlled strips of land, encouraging them to leave the territory on deportation flights, because you would then step up attempts to eradicate Hamas leaders. So effectively, you would exile all civilians from the territory so that you can do the job which Donald Trump has said you should be able to do, which is then eradicate Hamas. This is if they don't agree to the ceasefire deal. Are you able to comment on that at all?
I haven't seen or heard of that plan, so I can't comment specifically. But if Hamas does not agree to end this war that it launched 2 years ago, Israel is going to have no option but to pursue the military defeat of Hamas. And the question then is, how do you keep civilians safe and protected while going after the terrorists who are deliberately fighting from tunnels underneath their feet, firing rockets from between houses, using tunnel shafts inside schools, fighting out of civilian clothes, deliberately to get civilians killed? That is Hamas's strategy. Hamas's strategy is to try to get civilians on its own side killed. How do you keep them safe? And to do that, you are going to have to separate civilians from Hamas fighters to create areas where you can use that firepower.
How would you do that, do you think, Eylon? I mean, we've heard, haven't we, plans before by Israel Katz, the defense minister, for a humanitarian city. But they've been criticised. People say, well, that will be more like a concentration camp. This plan seems to indicate that actually for civilians' own safety, they should just leave the territory, go into other friendly countries whilst Israel finishes the job, I suppose.
And you understand here the immense challenge of trying to keep civilians safe in what is the most fiendishly difficult urban battlefield in history. When the war started, Israel tried to evacuate civilians to humanitarian zones where Hamas was not active. And then what happened? Hamas moved together with the civilians and started firing missiles from out of those civilian zones.
Yeah.
And Israel did not, unfortunately, enjoy the cooperation of UN agencies that would normally cooperate with a humanitarian evacuation. They were demanding that civilians remain exactly where they were in Hamas strongholds where terrorists were fighting from tunnels under their feet. So it's an immense challenge. And if we get there, and I hope we don't, tomorrow is 2 years since the beginning of this horrible war. But if Hamas refuses to end the war, international community's priority needs to be, how do we separate civilians from the Hamas fighters so that Israel can do what the whole world says must be done, which is this has to end with Hamas's disarmament and removal from power. And of course, the return of those hostages who've been languishing there for 2 years.
I mean, look, there will be ultimately condemnation if you are forcing the evacuation or forcing into smaller territories those Gazan civilians. That will be contentious. The other issue, I suppose, is how would you stop Hamas fighters, how would you stop them from fronting as civilians? How would you be able to identify Hamas fighters who will just then want to blend in with that civilian mass?
Well, Kate, if the question is between bombing Hamas targets with civilians around or getting civilians to areas of relative safety, I prefer to get them to areas of relative safety and doing everything we can so they don't have to pay even more of a price.
But then how do you know that you've got Hamas?
But this is the question. Well, this is a very difficult question. Hamas fights deliberately out of civilian clothes. There was an incident last week in which Israeli troops saw a suspected Hamas terrorist waving a white flag. They suspected in order to get close enough to the troops to put them in danger. Hamas deliberately disguises itself as civilians. That requires Israel to use very advanced intelligence, to use the most precise munitions it possibly can. But Hamas's deliberate strategy of fighting out of civilian clothes and areas is responsible for a great deal of civilian suffering. And it's a reminder of why this barbaric regime, one way or another, must be removed from power. Because if it does not, and if it ends this war feeling vindicated in that strategy, then it will drag the Middle East into another war, and it will use exactly the same strategy. And we can't let that happen. It would be far too destructive. Yeah. This has to be the last Gaza war.
What, in your mind, Eylon Levy, would the future of Gaza look like?
Literally everything.
I think Israel wants to hand over the Gaza Strip to a civilian administration that does not want to use it as a launchpad for attacks against Israel. And that means that not only must Hamas be dismantled, the Gaza Strip must be demilitarized, and the population must be de-radicalized as well. When the October 7th massacre happened, it triggered mass celebrations on the streets of Gaza. It boosted Hamas's popularity levels. It was extremely popular in Palestinian society. That ideology, the ideology that is committed to Israel's destruction, the genuinely genocidal ideology that motivated the barbaric atrocities of October 7th, that has to go. So together with Hamas being dismantled, the Gaza Strip demilitarized, and a serious de-radicalization program as well in the Gaza Strip, we can start to visualize a future of coexistence, Gaza side to side with Israel.
Perhaps you can clear something up for me. Within this peace plan, point 19 talks about Gaza redevelopment. When the Palestinian Authority reform programme is faithfully carried out, so they would need to reform, the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway to a Palestinian self-determination and statehood. That is something that, as far as we can understand, was denied by your Prime Minister. So after these discussions with Donald Trump, your Prime Minister took to Israeli media and said that there would never be a Palestinian statehood, that is not something that is in the peace agreement. So just iron that out for me. Which is true?
Well, the Israeli government does not support the creation of a Palestinian state because it believes it would put Israel in existential danger. It looks at the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip 20 years ago, sees the 20 years of rockets and ultimately ultimately the October 7th massacre we had, and said we cannot afford to withdraw from territory that would leave Israel 9 miles wide and put the whole of Tel Aviv within 30 seconds of rocket fire.
Okay.
So I think what this plan does,
so I'm
answering your question. The agreement lays out a very long-term horizon. It doesn't close the door to that possibility, but very many things have to happen in order to get to the stage where that's relevant, including de-radicalization in Gaza, which is point one of the plan, and that emphasizes the importance the U.S. administration attributes to de-radicalization. The demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, still many questions about whether that can happen, and the reform program of the Palestinian Authority. Let's remember, the Palestinian Authority has not held elections since 2006, and if elections were held today, Hamas would win by every measure. So very many processes of reform that need to be done before we get to the question of the ultimate resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's hope we can first end the war that Hamas began from the Gaza Strip 2 years ago, and then we can start looking more optimistically outwards.
Okay, look, our listeners are pointing out that the war began many, many moons ago, not just 2 years ago. Of course, it went into overdrive 2 years ago because of that terror attack by Hamas. But I think just people wanting to recognise here that relations between Israel and Gaza have been far from pleasant for quite some time.
Well, Kate, you're right that there has been an ongoing conflict since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in a violent coup in 2007 and started firing missiles at Israel. But on the eve of the war, there were tens of thousands of Gazans who were leaving Gaza every day to work in Israeli communities. Every day there were more goods and commodities going into the Gaza Strip, more cement. We know that all went into Hamas's tunnels, because Israel's policy was that economic development in the Gaza Strip would act as a deterrent against war. Gaza was opening up to the world. And so when Hamas violated the ceasefire on the morning of October 7th, 2023, invaded, took hostages, massacred innocent people in their homes, it triggered a war. And it triggered a regional war that has seen Israel attacked by the Iranian regime's other proxy armies on 7 fronts.
Eylon Levy, thank you for being with us, former Israeli government spokesperson. Thank you.